Good evening, everybody. It's great to welcome all of you tonight for what I think is going to be an inspiring and thought-provoking lecture by Sarah Whiting, our guest. I have the pleasure to know Sarah for more than 25 years. I think the first time I met you, I was working for Peter Eisman, and you came to the office. So this is a while ago. In her work, Sarah challenges us to see the contemporary metropolis not as a fixed entity, but as a dynamic, ever-evolving organism. She described, I don't think this is only what her work is, but I think it's part of the center where she's going to be talking tonight. And she described the metropolis as a place of multiplicity, simultaneity, and resonance, a network of relations held together by tentacles of movement, time, activity, and economic exchange. These tentacles, of course, are in constant flux, stretching, reaching, and intertwining, hopeful and expectant in their quest for connection and transformation. It will take too long to describe all the achievement in Sarah's impressive career, but I will say, as many of the people that we like to have in SCI-Arc, his career is a testament to her impact on architectural design, thought, and education. This is someone who has dedicated all her professional life not only to the practice of architecture, but to teach, and what Bob Stern used to call mega-teach, which is to be dean. She's currently the dean and the Joseph Louis Serf Professor of Architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, also known as the GSD. And as everybody who has been, the GSD is a place that generates an extreme passion and fanatism. And usually when somebody from Harvard comes to lecture, a lot of Harvard people show up, which is a unique thing. It doesn't happen with many other institutions, Sarah, I have to say. And she has shaped the minds of content students, pushing boundaries on what architecture can be. Before that, and nobody knows exactly why, she was a dean. So she's somebody who want to keep doing this, which this is something that probably, I hope you talk to your therapist about it. She was a dean at the Rice University School of Architecture, which also another fantastic school, and which of course highlights her commitment to architecture education and practice. Beyond academia, her work as co-founder at WW Architecture reflects her belief in the importance of practice as a tool for experimenting with and advancing architectural ideas. She has a unique also education. I was talking with Joe Day early today, and he said hi. She built a very unique education in Yale. I think she crafted herself, which I think it was probably a sign of times to come in terms of the combination of multiple ways to think about it. So she has also a master's degree from Princeton and a PhD from MIT. Sarah writes, edits, design, teach, and it has a very interdisciplinary perspective on the field. So there is a lot of intersection between architecture, politics, economics, society, and how the built environment is not just a reflect, but shapes the nature of public life. It's a good reminder that architecture is not just about constructing space, but about crafting experiences that resonate on both on personal and collective levels. And as I said, she's, again, the list of books and magazines and publications and things is way too long to mention here, but everybody who has been in the game for long enough know how important her contribution has been. So tonight, I encourage all of us to participate in the conversation, in the discussion. So she will provoke us with a framework for public life. So the complexity of this, but ultimately what I will say is the most important is what I think is crucial, which is always the intersection between teaching and practicing, to think and speculate on a permanent basis. And for all of us here in SCI-Arc, I would like to venture to say that for all of us, it's the only way to be in architecture. So please join me in welcome Sarah Whiting to SCI-Arc.
Oh, you guys actually start on time, which surprises me. So thank you, Hernán. That was very sweet of you. And thank you also to Yasil and to Phil for all your help and your patience in getting me here. It's really wonderful to see a lot of familiar faces, not all from the GSD. And I want to take this moment to congratulate Hernán on almost 10 years now of leadership and for building a SCI-Arc that you have a great team, and I look forward to seeing how it moves in the future. So I will say I also am grateful for this opportunity because my world as a dean, I know that Brett is here and he will sympathize, but your world as a dean doesn't leave you a lot of time for reflection. And so lectures are a little bit like assignments in studio. You have a deadline and you eventually will finish it, and that's what it is. So this is a little bit rough around the edges, but I'm very happy to have the chance to work on it. So just a sort of broad brush, I'm fascinated by cities, which sounds like a kind of dumb statement, especially saying it in LA, but it really is true. I think we're finally reaching a point right now where our cities are actually becoming contemporary, and that contemporaneity is political, economic, social, technical, and formal. And each of those isn't necessarily working in concert, and it's up to us to figure out how design fits into that. So what fuels my interest is pretty simple. How is it that the gazillion of people living on this earth actually work together, live together, forge a future world together? How is it that we live, work, and deal with one another socially, spatially, philosophically, politically, economically, or even just simply culturally? How is it that we all deal with one another? I'm especially curious how we live together in the complexity that's our contemporary urban environments. Now, I grew up with the free to be you and me world, Coke's Perfect Harmony, and other songs and slogans of unity, but even though I grew up during that period, I can't say I'm naive enough to be proposing one humanism or even one world. Certainly the politics in this country, let alone what's ripping apart the Middle East right now, demonstrates that that kind of assumption of one single humanity is not only naive, it's dangerous as a proposition. So I'm not proposing redesigning the world for perfect harmony. A gentle plea to this as a historical question, and so be patient, don't be too surprised. We don't have to go back to Aristotle and the Greeks, but bear with me for a moment. So Aristotle claimed that by nature, humans are political because we can't survive as individuals, think procreation, as well as simple challenges to survival. And he said that because we have the faculties of speech and reason, we're able to form and communicate moral concepts defining how it is we live together. A second point that Aristotle raised, and the one that interests me most right now, is that he saw the polis, the city-state, as a whole, not as a collection of aggregates. And this is a really important point that I'm going to come back to later. So taking that, I'd like to posit that our cities are dynamic wholes. They're complicated, imbricated wholes rather than aggregated ones. So Aristotle claimed, and this is in the 300s BC, that by nature we're political, and he talked about this whole as a collection of interdependent parts that coexist. So this question of how we define our societies, our cultures, is at the heart of most world issues today. You see it in the conflicts in the Middle East, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Haiti, in Springfield, Ohio. It also fuels our culture, literature, film, essays. It's actually interesting because it's the question, I think, that will continue to fuel culture. If you think about it, and this is a little bit of a digression, really good literature, a lot of really good literature is based on missing someone, a missed encounter, or getting lost. That's not possible anymore because of cell phones and GPS. And so either you base your literature on pre-1985 or you find something else. But the question of how societies come together, how culture comes together, remains actually a question that's at the basis of culture. You see it in the current issue of the New York Review of Books, the article reviewing some books on the question of nations themselves being artificial. You see it in Deadwood, which if you've never watched is pretty amazing for sort of looking at sort of how a group forms its own culture, its own society. It was in the indigenous spaces of the West in the 19th century in the US. So it was a space that wasn't under US rule, and so you get the story of a society forming its own laws, or a book I highly recommend to everyone, which is The Wall. So even more basic than societies coming together as nations and cities, how do we even engage one another as individuals? I'm fueled by fiction, and so I use this maybe as an excuse for explaining why I like to read so much. But this thread of that I think is at the heart of very good fiction is this inability to know another person. I'm a twin. A lot of people know that. I'm not an identical twin, but I've been around this other person since we were born or before, and yet I don't fully understand him at all times, and I can remain surprised by him, which I find a very interesting thing. So someone you think you know very, very well, or if you're in a long-term relationship, the same thing is true. And I think that, to me, is one of the most interesting things. Simone de Beauvoir's Age of Discretion, which is one of the novellas in Women Destroyed, is very much focused on this. So let's get back to cities. If we get back to this seemingly simple question of the city, how is it that we live together? Let's move from Aristotle's polis to a simple village, which is a village as a whole that has interconnected parts. You have, each sort of member of the village has its role, has his or her role. Here's a village in the Dordogne as an example. In the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan. He famously disagreed with Aristotle. He didn't believe that people naturally formed a polis working together. He believed that society required an absolute sovereign. And you can argue that this is indeed how feudal order functioned. You had kings, you had lords, you had serfs and peasants. The whole of the polis or the village operated because people had their set roles. So this was in 1651. I'm racing through history to get to the present, but sort of putting a few pins in moments. Let's move up a century. So the storming of the Bastille in 1789, or here you have Caillebott's Paris Street, Rainy Day. You can see it at the Art Institute of Chicago, a very beautiful painting from 1877. So along come the revolutions of the 18th century and the industrialization of the 19th century. And these are moments in history when the world had certain rules for how our collective lives were organized into cities, landscapes, and buildings. So with the revolutions in the 17th century, in the 18th century, and the rise of industrialization, you have the rise of the middle class and a sort of new group that breaks out of this feudal system that had been sort of defined, let's say, by Hobbes. Habermas, so we move from Hobbes to Habermas. In 1962, Jürgen Habermas wrote his book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, an inquiry into the category of bourgeois society, a title that just rolls off the tongue. It wasn't translated into English until 1989, which I think is super important for our context because it was translated at the very time when it was also questioned or advanced. And so in 1989, people like Jeff Ely, Nancy Fraser, Michael Warner, and others took Habermas's idea, translated it, made it available to an English-speaking public, but also sort of expanded his notion. So Habermas, who's still alive, was obsessed with the topic of communication and said there were 4 rules of communication. One, that communication, so he's talking about how do people communicate with one another. You're getting back to the people in, that if you think of Aristotle, how do all these people communicate when they're together in that polis? So his rules were, 1, that communication had to be intelligible, 2, that it had to be around a legitimate topic, 3, it had to be conversation that wasn't aimed at manipulation. I wish that rule were followed today. And 4, that it had to have values or norms as a kind of base. So this is what he called deliberative democracy. And this is how he qualified. He said, with the rise of the middle class, you also had the rise of what he called the fourth estate. So the fourth estate was media, which was this communicative possibility outside your feudal setup that allowed for voices of dissent. And so the fourth estate, and this was manifest in places like coffee houses. He pointed to different instances. So coffee houses where people could come together and talk politics, read the newspaper, talk politics, or the salon, the 19th century salon, where you again had people coming together to talk about things, again, around these kind of deliberative democracy terms that he identified as how the bourgeois sort of formed a world, again, a collective whole around language. So deliberative democracy works best among like-minded people with similar norms, customs, and backgrounds. And this is part of the critique that was levied against Habermas in the late 80s, is a realization that not all people talk with perfectly agreed upon norms, not all people have the politesse, or not all people have the backgrounds to understand one another. But our world grew, our cities across the world have really developed more as, I would say, aggregations of like-minded individuals in villages rather than the wholes, if you go back to Aristotle's characterization of a whole made up of interdependent parts as opposed to aggregations. And so our cities, what we see as cities, even our big cities, so if you take London, even with industrialization, the city is a collection of like-minded islands or aggregations. And so you see sort of, well, that got pixelated. Next time I'll have a bigger image. So you see residences that are similar. People live near other people who are like them in similar neighborhoods of houses or areas that are like one another. You can see this in Chicago, a city I've written a lot about and where I'm from, which was even identified in the 40s as, it was referred to as a city of neighborhoods, and it's still characterized that way today. Essentially, it's a city that's an aggregation of other cities, of little cities. And you think this is also why people favor neighborhoods. I think I'm one of the few people who actually questions whether neighborhoods are the best way for cities to be developed. Neighborhoods are often an enclave of like-minded people and also a way of kind of protecting yourself from people who aren't like you. So suburbia, of course, is maybe the most obvious version of this aggregation of like-minded parts. And you even have a lot of suburbs that have village cafes that sort of just take this idea of a suburb being a village and make it very evident. And so I keep looking for sort of where cities are different than just a collection of villages or neighborhoods as villages. Where are cities actually metropolises or something that's contemporary? So Jane Jacobs in 1961, exhibited her love for Greenwich Village, saw Greenwich Village as, the perfect city. It's where people came together, and you do get it's a little bit, the perfect example of a Habermasian coffee house, is the possibility of you get these conversations in Greenwich Village, and she said, this is exactly what cities should be. But of course, today Greenwich Village isn't the same. It's now a place where you have a monthly rent of at least $4K, and it's become incredibly homogenized. I would say that it was a fairly artificial island even in 1961, but now it's simply not possible, even the sort of Jane Jacobs dream. Manhattan generally has become an island, again, of self-similar people, so it's the diversity that you had previously has disappeared for homogenization across the island, thanks to wealth. And the coffee house itself has become homogenized. You get the Starbuckification of the world, but its positive qualities soon began to unravel, and even Habermas acknowledged the impossibility of coming to consensus. Already in 1962, he brought up the challenge of technology, and just last year, at the age of 94, he published a new structural transformation of the public sphere and deliberative politics, where he talks about the effect of technology on the public realm and essentially on destroying his belief, his possibility, his championing of deliberative democracy, and advocates for regulation, though he doesn't really explain how that will come about. I would point to the work of Jody Dean, who has written on communicative capitalism, where she points out that digital communication often leads you to a belief that you're talking to a bunch of different people, but as we know, there's actually a new sameness or a new enclave or a new village, let's say, that comes out of the fact that you end up talking to people just like yourselves, and that with the sort of, let's say, the excess of communication, she uses the kind of non-stick analogy, I like cooking analogies, where essentially nothing sticks anymore. Everything just gets thrown out, more and more discourse, but there isn't a discourse that's actually sticking or continuing. She also, I think, in a very interesting argument, makes a claim that the rise of technological communication and communicative capitalism has led to a neo-feudalism where the new lords are people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. So again, where does this leave us today in this world as designers or as educators of future designers? As Hernán noted, that's sort of where I see what I want to be. And I think we do have the possibility of saying that cities can be something other than an aggregation of like-minded people. So how are our cities understood broadly? And if you look at the popular press, it seems like there are really two ways that the popular press characterizes cities and occupants of cities, either as big data, and I will say the New York Times has a fantastic sort of team that are essentially translating very important things into data and diagrams, but they either tend to put urban topics into that category or into the category of an individual, very personal story. And so you'll see many stories that focus on one person's experience and sort of really a deep dive into that personal. So it's either offered as information, which is a collection of aggregated data, or aggregations of individuals. So again, the media isn't really helping us in trying to shift to the possibility of the city being a whole as opposed to an aggregation of parts. The urban reality actually is much more complex. It's not just these self-similar areas, and Queens offers the possibility of maybe still some possibility of seeing different people who come together and different elements that come together in a much more complex way. but it doesn't tend to be something that we see characterized. So one way forward, and again, this might just be a justification for my interest in fiction and in writing and reading, but one way forward would be narrative. So one more philosopher to add to our mix is Peter Sloterdijk, who in Atmospheric Politics returns us yet again to the polis. So it's just going to keep coming back as a topic. Unlike Aristotle, so remember Aristotle found the polis to be natural. Hobbes found it completely unnatural. Sloterdijk acknowledges that the polis is an entirely artificial construct, intended, as he said, to, quote, answer the challenge posed by the improbability of bringing numerous strangers together to coexist behind shared walls. A phrase I think that's really beautifully written. Sloterdijk's interest, which, as you understand by now, I fully share, is how do we find an highly artificial xenophilia in the most confined spaces, where love thy neighbor isn't just a question of loving your next of kin. He focuses on the conditions that make this artificial environment possible, which gets us closer to design. I promise I'm getting closer to design. So he's not just focusing on judgment or communication, this judgment or these norms agreed to by citizens, which is the quagmire that Habermas got himself into by focusing on norms or rules of communication. But instead, Sloterdijk focuses on the conditions that result from what he calls a proto-architectonic ability to construct what he calls waiting rooms that can disarm citizens. It's a really nice construct. He points to the Palm House, of all places, he points to the Palm House at Kew Gardens as an ideal metaphor for this desired condition. So completed in 1848, the Palm House finally enabled the Brits to be able to bring home the plants that they were discovering in their tropical colonies. Previously, all the palm trees and other exotic plants they had brought back died the minute they got to England, which makes sense because of the climate. Sloterdijk notes that with this metaphor, he says, unless you host these trees, these palms, in a familiar environment, they won't survive. Here he's borrowing from Bruno Latour, who claimed that the polis, or the Greek city, was akin to a greenhouse, enabling different people to coexist, to naturalize in a shared, constructed, controlled environment. In short, to foster xenophilia, commonality has to be constructed. A climate of openness and connection has to be consciously made. Sloterdijk further recognized that commonality has to be repeatedly constructed and reconstructed. It's cumulative. That's groovy. Commonality isn't formed instantly. It's not a sort of one-size-fits-all. It's something that's constantly evolving. And he saw all citizens as being both actors and spectators. So we're getting closer to Aristotle's belief in this whole as opposed to an aggregate of parts. By seeing these people as seeing all citizens as actors and spectators, they're a dynamic collective who are constantly feeding off of one another, not isolated individual parts that are simply aggregated. And for Sloterdijk, the written word is an important instrument, strategy, or technique, whatever you want to call it. It's a sort of design technique for society, because the written word creates these waiting rooms, a little bit like Kew Gardens, like the Palm House. The written word allows you the time and the space for constructing commonality. So he's acknowledging that commonality is something that can't be instant, and that often in a conversation, which we all want to foster, especially in schools, but a conversation doesn't always offer you the time to actually develop ideas. And so he's saying writing is a little bit like a waiting room. It allows time for you to read someone's writing, think about it, develop your own ideas, and build off of that. So that idea that the polis actually needs these kind of waiting rooms, whether it's like the Palm Gardens, the Palm House, or whether it's like a text. Daniel Burnham, I said I was going to go sort of freewheeling all over the place. So We've come to Chicago in 1909. Daniel Burnham recognized this strategy, the value of writing, when he produced the Burnham Plan of 1909, which was published as a book. The Burnham Plan wasn't made just as drawings. It was made as a book that offered a pause for Chicagoans to absorb it. And even more striking was the Wacker Manual of 1911, which was a sort of slimmed-down version of the Burnham Plan. It was done by Walter Moody, and it was made for the 8th grade civics curriculum. Every 8th grader in Chicago, in the Chicago public school system, studied the Wacker Manual, which again, it's just a summary, let's say, of the Chicago plan. And they had this in their curriculum for about 20 years, which I would argue is why Chicago has such a rich history of architecture and sort of architectural culture. And you'll note that that rich history kind of took a dive in the 80s. You see sort of the effect of when they took this out of the curriculum, I would argue. But here you get this idea. So one strategy for us, I'm now beginning to shift to offering you ways forward. One strategy is to find ways of writing into different worlds, like a curriculum, to essentially get our ideas out into a public audience. So another way, another strategy for transforming cities from pockets of sameness to dynamic wholes is to engage ourselves in local politics, where the spaces of our shared commonality are often determined. And so here you see there's a rezoning happening right now in Cambridge for trying to allow for 6-story buildings, and actually has led to a very interesting debate within Cambridge to try and upzone parts of Cambridge. And so I encourage you to be locally active in terms of shaping the city. Another way of breaking the isolation of parts and creating spaces for xenophilia comes from landscape architecture. If you think of Frederick Law Olmsted's Emerald Necklace in Boston, it's a 7-mile chain of parks that stretches from the Boston Common to Franklin Park, dating from the late 19th century. And these are the spaces that bring people together. They're the sort of, you could call them the kind of public environmental tentacles of a dynamic whole. It's where people unlike you find themselves in proximity. And even if we don't today have the same, let's say, civic investment in park systems that are at this scale. I mean, think of this as 7 miles, or think of Central Park in New York, or the parks in Paris. Even now, I would argue that there's a series of parks in Cambridge. So Kendall Square famously transformed into the head of biotech. It's where both Moderna and Pfizer are located. So all your COVID shots came from this little part of Cambridge. Kendall Square is pretty awful in terms of its urbanism and its buildings, but it's actually beginning to be knit together by these series of very small parks and landscape interventions that are starting to create a tapestry of landscape that's beginning to give some coherence to an incoherent whole. And so you're starting to see the possibility of creating, let's say, a landscape waiting room even if you don't have the continuity that you had in the 19th century. How do we enable xenophilia, however, in a public realm where people don't engage one another, where they're plugged into their headphones or actively avoid talking to one another? And how do we also avoid falling into the trap of a singular narrative? So here I'll suggest the work of cultural theorist Lauren Berlant, who focused on public affect and emotion, and how these sentiments can be a means of undergirding our exchanges as actors and spectators in public space. The Hundreds is a book that she co-wrote with Kathleen Stewart, and it collects snippets of ordinary life, public ordinariness, but rather than kind of just, let's say, championing ordinariness in a way that, say, Jane Jacobs would have done in 1961, They thread through an ordinariness that's more like the cumulative that Sloterdijk was suggesting previously. So one example is a dog walking story where she talks about being out one day for a walk, and there's a woman walking her dog, and the dog goes and does its business on someone's lawn, and the person who owns the house gets really angry and starts yelling at the woman, and Lauren Berlant starts to have an exchange with the woman, because this sort of breaks this exchange and the kind of civic disharmony of this guy yelling at her with her little puppy dog leads to a break in the kind of the wall that one puts around oneself in a city. And so the possibility of engagement appeared. Or she recites other moments like that in 7-Elevens and places like that. So the possibility of, through, again, emotion or public affect, you can have this way of creating a commonality. In addition to writing as a means, or narrative, or these stories or exchanges as a means of constructing waiting rooms, as he called them, Sloterdijk also pointed to installations as moments that surprise people and, again, create a kind of moment of exchange commonality among a public that wasn't there before. So something for people to talk around. Dennis Adams' Bus Shelter 1, which was a public art-funded project in New York, replaced the M60 bus shelter at Lincoln Center from fall of 1983 to spring of 1987, and is a perfect example of what Sloterdijk was pointing to. The display panel, as described on the Public Art Fund site, which in a regulation shelter would feature commercial advertisements, instead holds photos. It held photos of Vietnamese boat people, and then the back had these texts that said things like "become the symptom" or "invisibility is your revenge." And so by choosing these seemingly unrelated images and texts, Adams purposely chose to sidestep the idea of a given message in favor of engaging the public in an interpretive role. And he also added a bench which hadn't existed in the New York bus shelters at that point, even though the bench wasn't under a shelter cover. So he created a new possibility and created this instrument essentially for creating a public exchange in New York. And as a sort of side note, and this is just a way of claiming a topic that I haven't had time to work on yet, but want to, I'm fascinated by the history of the Jean-Claude Decaux. The Decaux monopoly over urban furniture is a fascinating one. So Decaux grew up in a house in the family of shoemakers in the 50s in France. And he started an advertising business. He broke off from his family and he started advertising at bus shelters, and then led to, in 1964, he formed his company that has led to this great monopoly of urban furniture. And someday I'm gonna have the time to work on that. Anyway, I'm gonna shift now to how one might try and create these possibilities for exchange, for commonality in design, by pointing to WW's work, my work with Ron Witte, and I have to say Ron gets more credit than I do since I spent a little too much time at school. So I'm going to talk through a couple projects, and these are small moves. I think that it's the idea of how one breaks the possibility or the dominance of cities being just collections of neighborhoods or villages is actually a hard thing to change. And so forgive us if these suggestions end up being a little bit small. Circular Logic was our entry into the Kaohsiung pop music maritime museum competition. Taiwan had for a while a series of these competitions, I'm sure everyone here entered them as well, where they combined two programs that seem incompatible into public buildings that are actually getting built in Taiwan. But this was a pop music center, and Maritime Museum, and we were focused on the Pop Music Center because we were fascinated by the fact that music tends to be highly individualized. You're listening in your earbuds, or it's highly collective. You're listening in a big concert hall. And so we were interested in this idea of an ambient whole. We were also really interested in the circle as a geometry that's really hard to work with in terms of design, in terms of something that doesn't, we were trying to say, okay, can a circle be broken as something that's entirely autonomous? So we thought about how does a circle engage its context? How does a circle tie into its context? And we decided to do a project that was made up entirely of circles, which is not a good way to win a competition. We certainly didn't. But it was an interesting way to try and figure out how can you deal with the geometry, the sort of tyrannical geometry of the circle. And so you get pies, you get tangents, you get radii. And so we had enormous fun sort of being obsessed about the circle. But the more important part of the project was the idea that the components of the project, so there were auditoria, there were parts of the museum, there were recording studios, that each one of them was individualized, but how do you bring them together in a whole? So part of it was how they actually tie together in terms of a circulation system. But the other was how do they tie into the city? The site was a landfill in a bay. And so it was highly artificial. And so we essentially were making a city of circles and then tying it back into a gridded city around it. And so you can see how it was that we tried to actually, through geometry, the tools that we have as designers, how to create these relationships and actually create possibilities where you create connections, or you create the possibilities of two things coming together. Another project is, this is a project that we did for a client in Changsha, China. This was actually for Kahui, which is just outside Changsha. Changsha is a huge city, and she had property outside Changsha, which is an area that had a series of flower farms and tea plantations, a very gorgeous landscape, and she wanted to try and help protect the farmers in this landscape before it got swallowed up by big industry that was sort of creeping up from Changsha and big buildings. And so this was really a building that she didn't really have a program for. This was a sort of long story of this, well, let me go back to this. There's a long story of this. Went through several sites, it went through several programs, but essentially she kept saying she really didn't have a sense of program or site, and so we were working really with an idea of total flexibility. And again, we try, instead of the circle, we tried to say, okay, how do you deal with flexibility without just succumbing to doing Mises' universal space? And so we created a building that offered small rooms, big rooms, little rooms, but each with definition, and how they could then mix into one another to create as much flexibility as possible. Partly this goes back to our interest from a very early project that remains for me one of the most important projects that we did and never realized, which is the IntraCenter in Lexington, Kentucky, where different wall sizes and shapes created what we called nested parentheses of program that brought different kinds of programs. This was a community center in Lexington that allowed different programs to kind of oscillate or resonate with one another. And again, I would say that our project at WW has always been about how form and program can work together to create different possibilities, again, cumulative possibilities that aren't singular. So going back to Kahui, it was essentially, we had really very little coming from the client. So it was this big room, and then we created some ways of defining it through these slots and holes. It's 3 courtyards and 3 slots that create difference among the 3 floors and allow for the possibility that it operates. It led to, this maybe is a little bit the Kaohsiung continuing for us. It led to realizing that it is through the precision of certain geometric moves that you create the possibility for these pieces to operate as connectors or as sort of, let's say, relational devices, formal devices that can generate programmatic possibilities without being fixed, which is the challenge that we like to give ourselves constantly. And so the 3 floors essentially offer different ways of occupying and different relationships to these courtyard spaces that can be understood either as part of those floors or as autonomous spaces into themselves. And so the surfaces also continue in part across these different spaces. 2 more projects just really quickly. This is actually our home and office space, a building that we renovated in Cambridge, not far from Moderna and Pfizer, that has no yard. It's right up against the street edge. So how is it that you can live in a building, work in a building, and have a very direct relationship to the street? And how do you mediate that relationship through architecture and through surface? So one that's very simple thing is that we created a sort of a little antechamber between the street and the front door that allows for a space that's in between. Last Halloween, a little boy told us that he always thought it was a little bit of heaven, as he said, which was a really startling thing to hear because there's a very bright light in there. And so there's this space that's just very white that he seemed to be fascinated by. But so people going by are almost in your living room, and that is mediated, sorry, let me go back there, by screens that essentially allow us to see knees, dogs, and small children that go by. And sometimes people will lean down and actually look in, which is always startling. But essentially you can create through just a surface, not a curtain, but a shade that's at a certain height, you can create a relationship between the outside and the inside, partial relationship with people going by, or in the office, we actually have the shades all the way up. So there's a very direct relationship with people walking along the street. And then finally, the L House in Houston, which is a cube building with a circular courtyard, and we were interested in how making a courtyard that's circular and having 3 sizes of windows that are very precisely put, how you can create relationships that are visual and also spatial within one relatively small house. And it creates what we called wobbly axes that are sort of these wobbly axis enfilades. So instead of a fixed enfilade that defines a space, by having these wobbly axes that you catch because of walking around the circular courtyard and these circular or the curved windows, you catch glimpses across this space that are constantly changing. And so they stitch together spaces, sunlight, air, social organizations, landscapes, interiors, exteriors, and functional definitions, which is a lot to put on one little house. But essentially it's saying just by geometry, just by placing windows very deliberately, you can create different possible relationships. This at a smaller scale than the city, but essentially the same argument that it is through the specifics of geometry, of making connections, of form, space, that we can create the architectural, the urban, and landscape waiting rooms to offer some degree of commonality, to offer some possibility for a xenophilia that I think is ever more necessary today. Thank you.